There are things which we hold very dear. The continuity of seasons, the return of spring after winter, the assumption that the sun which sets tonight will rise tomorrow, that the rains will come and the crops will grow, and the children born into this world will inherit a world recognizably like the one their parents knew. These are not luxuries of thought. They are the foundations upon which every human civilization has been built, from the first settlements along the Tigris and Euphrates to the cities that glow tonight on every continent. And I must tell you, with a precision that I wish were less certain, with a reluctance that I hope you will understand, that approximately 100 nuclear weapons detonated over cities in the space of a few days would be sufficient to end this continuity. Not to damage it, not to interrupt it, to end it. I should like to think a little about what this means, not as abstraction, not as strategy, not in the language of megatonnage and throw weight that has become the peculiar dialect of those who plan for the unplannable, but as a physical reality, governed by laws as precise and as indifferent as the law of gravitation. Because what I am describing is not a speculation. It is not a nightmare conjured by those who oppose nuclear weapons for political reasons, though I have been accused of being such a person, and the accusation, while it misses the point, is not entirely without foundation. What I am describing is a consequence of atmospheric physics, of radiative transfer, of the behavior of particulate matter in the stratosphere, a consequence as firmly grounded in science as the chain reaction itself. And it has a name, given to it not by politicians or poets, but by physicists: nuclear winter. The story begins, as so many of the stories that have shaped our age begin, with fire. When a nuclear weapon detonates over a city, the immediate effects are those with which the world became grimly familiar after Hiroshima and Nagasaki: the blast wave, the thermal radiation, the prompt nuclear radiation. A 1 megaton weapon, and there are many in the current arsenals far larger than this, produces a fireball with a temperature of roughly 100 million degrees at its center in the first microseconds, cooling to perhaps 10 million degrees as it expands. This fireball, rising, creates a vacuum beneath it, and the air rushing in to fill that vacuum generates winds of several hundred miles per hour. Everything within a radius of approximately 4 miles that is combustible, and in a modern city nearly everything is combustible: wood, plastic, paper, asphalt, fuel, textiles, human flesh, ignites, not in isolated fires, in a single continuous conflagration. The phenomenon is called a firestorm, and it is not new. It occurred at Hamburg in 1943, at Dresden in 1945, at Tokyo in March of 1945, produced by conventional incendiary weapons. But a nuclear firestorm differs from these in scale, in intensity, and in a consequence that was not fully understood until the early 1980s, when a group of scientists, among them Richard Turco, Owen Toon, Thomas Ackerman, James Pollock, and Carl Sagan, whose initials gave us the acronym TTAPS, published a study that changed, or should have changed, the way we think about nuclear war. What Turco, Toon, and their colleagues showed was that a nuclear firestorm over a modern city would loft enormous quantities of soot, black carbon, into the upper troposphere and lower stratosphere, to altitudes of 10 to 15 kilometers and higher. And unlike the dust and debris from volcanic eruptions, which settles out of the atmosphere in weeks or months, this soot, because it is black, because it absorbs sunlight rather than reflecting it, is heated by solar radiation and lofted still higher into the stratosphere proper, above the level where rain can wash it out. And there it remains, not for weeks, not for months, for years. Let me be precise about the numbers, because the numbers are what distinguish this from mere anxiety. The studies conducted by Alan Robock and Owen-Toon, beginning in 2007, using modern climate models far more sophisticated than those available to the TTAPS group, three-dimensional general circulation models, coupled atmosphere-ocean models, models that account for the diurnal cycle, for seasonality, for the complex feedback loops between temperature and precipitation. These studies found that a regional nuclear conflict involving approximately 100 Hiroshima-sized weapons, each with a yield of 15 kilotons, a small fraction, I should note, of the arsenals currently maintained by the United States and Russia alone, that such a conflict, if directed at urban targets, would inject approximately 5 million tons of black carbon into the upper atmosphere. 5 million tons, or 5 teragrams. And the consequences of those 5 teragrams would be felt by every living person on Earth. The soot layer would reduce incoming solar radiation at the Earth's surface by 20 to 35%. Global average surface temperatures would drop by approximately 1.5 degrees Celsius in the first year. This may sound modest. It is not. The cooling during the last ice age, when glaciers covered most of North America and northern Europe, when sea levels were 390 feet lower than today, when the world was a fundamentally different place, that cooling was approximately 4 to 7 degrees Celsius below the present average. A drop of 1.5 degrees represents, in climatic terms, a profound disruption, brought about not over millennia, but in weeks. But this is only the regional scenario. One must not stop here. A full-scale exchange between the United States and Russia, and the current arsenals contain between them something on the order of 4,000 deployed strategic warheads, with yields ranging from 100 kilotons to over a megaton. Such an exchange, directed primarily at military targets, industrial centers, and population concentrations, would loft between 150 and 180 teragrams of soot into the stratosphere. The resulting cooling would reach 8 to 10 degrees Celsius below the current global average. In the interior of continents, in the great agricultural regions of North America, of Europe, of China, temperatures would drop by 20 to 30 degrees Celsius. Growing seasons would effectively cease. Sunlight reaching the surface would be reduced by 70% or more. The sky, and this is a detail that haunts me, though perhaps it should not, given all the other horrors, the sky would darken, not to the black of night, but to a perpetual twilight, a gray half-light in which photosynthesis would slow or stop, in which crops would fail, in which the complex web of life that depends on sunlight, which is to say, all life, would begin to unravel. One finds in the literature of many traditions descriptions of a world deprived of light. The Norse called it Fimbulvetr, the Great Winter. 3 successive winters with no intervening summer, which precedes Ragnarok, the end of the gods. In Dante's Inferno, the deepest circle of hell is not fire, but ice. Satan frozen in a lake at the center of the earth, his great wings beating uselessly, generating a wind that keeps the ice forever frozen. I read Dante as a young man in the original Italian, and I found the image puzzling then. I do not find it puzzling now. The most complete destruction is not the destruction by fire, which at least has the quality of transformation. The most complete destruction is the cold, the absence of warmth, the cessation of growth, the stillness. And here one must be honest about a dimension of this problem that is not often discussed, because it is too uncomfortable, because it implicates not merely the weapons themselves, but the entire structure of thought that has sustained the nuclear age. The doctrine of deterrence, mutually assured destruction, as it came to be called, with an acronym that is either an act of dark comedy or an unconscious confession. This doctrine rests on the assumption that nuclear war is so terrible that no rational actor would initiate it. And this assumption, as far as it goes, may be correct. But nuclear winter introduces a complication that the strategists of deterrence did not anticipate, or if they did anticipate it, did not wish to examine too closely. It is this: the harm of a nuclear war is not limited to the belligerents. It is not even limited to the hemisphere in which the weapons are detonated. The soot does not respect borders. The stratosphere is continuous. A war between India and Pakistan, two nations which possess between them perhaps 300 nuclear warheads, could produce a famine that kills 2 billion people worldwide, most of them in nations that had no part in the conflict, that did not choose the war, that may not have even known it was happening until the sky began to darken and the temperatures began to fall. John Donne wrote, and I have returned to this passage many times because it seems to me to contain a truth that physics can demonstrate but not originate. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. He wrote this as a meditation on mortality, on the interconnection of human souls, but it applies with equal force, with a force that Donne could not have imagined, to the physical reality of nuclear winter. The atmosphere is the continent. We are all part of the main. And the bell that tolls for Lahore or Islamabad tolls also for Sao Paulo, for Lagos, for Jakarta, for every city where people depend on the global agricultural system that nuclear winter would destroy. I think it can only help to look a little more at the mechanism, because understanding the mechanism is, or ought to be, a prerequisite for understanding the moral situation. The critical variable is not the explosive yield of the weapons. It is the mass of combustible material in the target cities. This is a point that deserves emphasis, because it means that the nuclear winter problem has, in a certain sense, grown worse since the Cold War, not better. The cities of the world are larger now. They contain more fuel, more buildings, more vehicles, more synthetic materials that burn with particular intensity and produce particular volumes of black carbon. A 15-kiloton weapon, primitive by modern standards, roughly the yield of Little Boy, detonated over a city of 5 million people, would ignite a firestorm consuming an area of roughly 100 square kilometers. And it is the fire, not the blast, that does the atmospheric damage. The weapon is merely the match. The city is the fuel. The physics of soot lofting is governed by what we call radiative heating, the absorption of solar energy by the black carbon particles, which heats the surrounding air, causing it to rise, carrying the soot to ever higher altitudes in a process that is, in its basic dynamics, not unlike the formation of a thunderstorm, though the scale and the duration are vastly different. Once the soot reaches the stratosphere, above approximately 12 kilometers in the mid-latitudes, it is above the tropopause, above the level where weather occurs, above the reach of precipitation. And because the particles are small, typically between 1/10 and 1 micrometer in diameter, they have very low settling velocities. They do not fall. They drift. And as they absorb sunlight, they heat the stratosphere while cooling the surface below, creating a temperature inversion that stabilizes the layer and prevents its dispersal. It is, if one may use such a word for something so terrible, an elegant mechanism, a self-reinforcing process by which the consequences of the war perpetuate and amplify themselves long after the last warhead has detonated. And here we arrive at something more difficult still, the question of recovery, or rather, the question of whether recovery is possible in any meaningful sense. The Robock-Toon models suggest that the cooling from a full-scale nuclear war would persist for more than a decade. The ozone layer would be severely depleted by 40 to 70% in the mid-latitudes, because the heating of the stratosphere accelerates the catalytic destruction of ozone by nitrogen oxides, which are themselves produced in vast quantities by the fireballs. This means that even as the soot slowly clears and sunlight returns, the ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface would be far more intense than normal, damaging crops, causing widespread blindness in animals and humans, and further disrupting the already devastated ecosystems. The combination of cold, darkness, enhanced ultraviolet radiation, and the collapse of agriculture would, according to the most careful estimates, threaten the survival of the majority of the human population, not through direct nuclear effects, but through famine. I have been wrong about many things in my life, and I hold it as a principle, perhaps the most important principle I have learned, that a willingness to be wrong is a prerequisite for understanding anything at all. But there are certain things about which I do not think the researchers are wrong, because the physics is too well understood, because the models have been validated against known events. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, which produced the year without a summer in 1816, with a global cooling of less than 1 degree Celsius from merely 100 teragrams of sulfate aerosol. Or the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991, which cooled the Earth by roughly 0.5 degrees Celsius with approximately 30 teragrams of sulfate. The nuclear winter models, tested against these volcanic analogs, reproduce the observed effects with considerable fidelity. And the soot from burning cities is, ton for ton, a more effective blocker of sunlight than volcanic sulfate, because it absorbs rather than merely scatters. One would like to believe, I would like to believe, that the existence of this knowledge would be sufficient to prevent the catastrophe it describes. But I have lived long enough, and I have seen enough, to know that knowledge and action are not as closely linked as one might hope. We knew before Hiroshima what the bomb would do. I knew. I had calculated the yields, the radii, the casualties, and yet we proceeded. Not because we were evil. I do not believe that any of us at Los Alamos were evil, though I have asked myself the question many times and have not always arrived at a comfortable answer. But because the logic of the situation, the momentum of the enterprise, the fear of the alternative, all conspired to make the use of the weapon seem, at the time, like an organic necessity. And I have come to distrust that word, necessity, more than almost any other in the language, because it is the word that men use when they wish to do something terrible and cannot bear to admit that they are choosing to do it. The optimist thinks that nuclear winter will never happen because rational actors would never start a nuclear war. The pessimist fears that the optimist is defining rationality too narrowly. I have known many brilliant men, men of extraordinary intelligence, men who could manipulate the equations of quantum electrodynamics with the ease that a musician handles a familiar instrument, who were capable, in moments of fear or pride or institutional pressure, of astonishing foolishness. Genius is no guarantee of wisdom. I said that once, about someone else. I might as well have said it about all of us. There is a concept in Hindu philosophy. I encountered it first through the Vedas and later through the Gita, the concept of karma, which is not, as it is popularly understood in the West, a system of cosmic reward and punishment, but rather a statement about the nature of action itself, that every action has consequences which extend far beyond the intention of the actor, that the web of causation is so vast and so intricate that no human being can fully trace it, and that the obligation to act rightly is therefore absolute, because you cannot know and cannot control where the effects of your action will end. The scientists who designed the weapons did not intend nuclear winter. The generals who planned the targeting did not intend global famine. The politicians who maintained the arsenals did not intend the end of agriculture. And yet, if these things come to pass, the chain of causation will lead back, inexorably, inevitably, to the decisions made by identifiable human beings in identifiable rooms. The karma is real, even if the intention was absent. And this, I think, is the deepest lesson of nuclear winter, deeper even than the physics, though the physics is what makes the lesson inescapable. It is the lesson of interconnection, not as a sentimentality, not as a bumper sticker, but as a physical fact, as real and as measurable as the temperature of the stratosphere. We are connected, all of us, all 7 billion and more, by the air we breathe, by the sunlight that feeds our crops, by the thin and fragile atmosphere that makes this planet habitable rather than a frozen rock like Mars or a furnace like Venus. And a war between any two nuclear-armed nations, anywhere on Earth, is a war against the atmosphere itself, against the climate, against the conditions that sustain human life everywhere. I do not know how to ensure that this knowledge is translated into the restraint it demands. If I knew, I would have devoted what remained of my life to nothing else. I spent years, after the war, after Trinity, after Hiroshima, advocating for the international control of atomic energy, for the sharing of nuclear materials under international authority, for the Acheson-Lilienthal plan that bore, unjustly, Bernard Baruch's name. It failed. The Cold War followed. The arsenals grew. The hydrogen bomb was built, over my objection, for what little my objection was worth. And now we live in a world where not 2 but 9 nations possess nuclear weapons, where the total number of warheads, though reduced from the obscene peaks of the 1980s, still exceeds 12,000. Where the knowledge of how to build these weapons is, in principle, available to anyone with sufficient resources and sufficient determination. There are no secrets about the world of nature. I said that long ago, and it remains true. The physics of fission is in the textbooks. The physics of thermonuclear fusion is in the textbooks. And the physics of nuclear winter, the atmospheric science, the radiative transfer calculations, the climate modeling, is in the journals, available to anyone who cares to look. The question is not whether we possess the knowledge. We do. The question is whether we possess the wisdom, and here I use that word with full awareness of how inadequate it is, how threadbare it has become from overuse and under-practice. The wisdom to act upon what we know. I remember, and I return to this memory because it seems to me to capture something essential. I remember the silence after the Trinity test. Not the silence before, which was the silence of anticipation, of fear, of not knowing. The silence after. The light had been and gone, a light so intense that it was visible 200 miles away, that it turned night into noon for a fraction of a second. And then there was the silence, before the sound arrived, before the shock wave reached us. In that silence, which lasted perhaps 30 seconds, I think each of us confronted something that could not be spoken. A few people laughed. A few people cried. Most people were silent. And I thought of the line from the Gita, the Vishvarupa, the vision of the cosmic form. And the line that came to me was not the famous one, not the one about death and the destroyer of worlds, but another, earlier in the chapter, where Arjuna, seeing the universal form for the first time, says, "I see all the gods in your body, and all kinds of living creatures assembled together. I see Brahma, the creator, on his lotus seat, and I see all the sages and celestial serpents." It is a vision of totality, of everything that exists, seen at once, in a single terrible and beautiful instant. And it seemed to me then, and it seems to me still, that this is what nuclear physics had given us, a vision of the total interconnection of all things, revealed not through meditation or prayer, but through the most violent act of destruction that human beings had ever accomplished. The peoples of this world must unite, or they will perish. I said that in 1945. The physics of nuclear winter has made it not a moral aspiration, but a statement of atmospheric fact. The soot does not negotiate. The stratosphere does not recognize sovereignty. The cooling is indiscriminate. And if we, all of us, not merely the scientists, not merely the statesmen, but every human being who breathes the air and eats the food that grows in sunlight, if we cannot find a way to ensure that these weapons are never used, then we will have proved that the capacity for knowledge and the capacity for wisdom are in our species fatally mismatched. I do not think this is inevitable. I have seen too much foolishness to be an optimist, but I have also seen too much courage, too much decency, too much of what is best in human beings to be a nihilist. The same species that split the atom also wrote the Gita, also built the cathedrals, also composed the quartets of Beethoven, also discovered the structure of DNA in a spirit of wonder that was, at its best, entirely innocent of any desire to harm. We contain both capacities, the capacity for destruction and the capacity for creation. And which one prevails is not a matter of physics. It is a matter of choice, of will, of the sustained, difficult, unglamorous work of building institutions and agreements and habits of mind that make the right choice more likely and the wrong choice less so. I said once that science is not everything, but science is very beautiful. I still believe this. The mathematics of radiative transfer, the fluid dynamics of the atmosphere, the intricate coupling of ocean and air, these are beautiful things, as beautiful in their way as a sonnet or a fugue. And the fact that this beauty reveals to us the mechanism of our possible annihilation does not diminish the beauty. It deepens it. It makes it hurt. And that hurt, that inability to separate the beauty of understanding from the terror of what is understood, is, I think, the permanent condition of anyone who has looked closely at the nuclear age and refused to look away. We cannot afford to look away. The atmosphere is thin, a shell of gas no thicker proportionally than the skin of an apple. Everything we are, everything we have built, everything we love exists within that shell. And 100 bombs, a number so small that it could be delivered by a single submarine, a number that represents less than 1% of the current global arsenal, 100 bombs falling on 100 cities could darken that shell, cool the earth beneath it, and set in motion a cascade of agricultural collapse and famine that would reach every corner of every continent. The knowledge is ours. The choice is ours. And if we choose wrongly, or if we fail to choose at all, which in matters of this consequence amounts to the same thing, then the winter will come, not from the heavens, but from ourselves. And in some sort of crude sense which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, it will have been because we knew and did not act upon our knowing.